My wife tried to humiliate me by going out with her alpha lover. My reaction left her stunned. I don't know when it began, this quiet unraveling of what we once had. Maybe it was when Lily started coming home a little later each night, her laughter echoing faintly from the driveway before the front door opened. Or maybe it was when her phone began buzzing more often, a flurry of messages she never felt the need to share. At first, I told myself it was nothing. She's always been social, the kind of person who thrives in a crowd. But lately, it felt like she was thriving in every crowd except the one that included me. One evening, I tried to make things special. I cooked her favorite meal, spaghetti with that spicy marinara sauce she loved, and set the table with the candles we hadn't used since our anniversary. I even put on the playlist we used to dance to in the living room, hoping it would spark something between us. She came home 2 hours later than she'd said she would, her cheeks flushed and her smile bright. "Sorry, Ethan, the time got away from me," she said, brushing a quick kiss on my cheek before noticing the effort I'd put into the evening. "Oh," she said, her smile faltering for just a moment. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble. I already ate with the girls." The girls. Always the girls. I sat across from her at the table, eating alone while she scrolled through her phone, laughing at something I wasn't privy to. The candles burned down to stubs, their wax pooling like some metaphor for the way I was feeling, melting away, unnoticed. It wasn't just the missed dinners or the late nights. It was the way she stopped asking about my day, the way her gaze skimmed over me like I was part of the furniture. I'd catch glimpses of her, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings, or laughing at her reflection as she sprayed on some new perfume. And it struck me how beautiful she was, how distant she had become. One night, I tried to talk to her about it. "Lily," I started, as she stood by the door, slipping on her heels. "Can we talk for a minute?" She paused, halfway through buckling her strap. "Can it wait?" "I'm running late." "No," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "It can't." She sighed, straightening up to face me, her arms crossed. "What is it, Ethan? I really don't have time for this." I searched for the right words, trying to explain how it felt to be left behind while she built a life I wasn't part of. I feel like we're drifting apart, like I'm not even a priority anymore." Her expression tightened, irritation flickering in her eyes. "Ethan, I'm not a child. I need time for myself, for my friends. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did. "It's just a phase," she added, grabbing her purse. "We'll talk later." But later never came. Each night, I waited. Each morning, I told myself it would get better. But the silence in the house grew heavier, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to fill it with work, with hobbies, with anything to distract me from the echo of her absence. I didn't want to believe it was falling apart. I wanted to believe we could fix it, that she'd see how much I needed her and remember how much we meant to each other. But every time she walked out the door without a second glance, hope slipped further away, leaving me alone in a house that no longer felt like home. I've always believed that the little things are what hold a marriage together. The quick kisses before leaving for work, the texts asking about your day, the shared silence while watching a movie. But it's also the little things that can pull it apart. At first, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Lily had always been social, and I told myself that this was just a phase, a way for her to blow off steam. But as the weeks turned into months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The late nights became more frequent. The explanations became shorter. "Just drinks with the girls," she'd say, brushing past me on her way to the bedroom, leaving a faint trail of perfume and exhaustion in her wake. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but her tone made it clear that any questions would only lead to frustration. And then there was the phone. It was always in her hand or face down on the counter, buzzing with notifications she never shared. I wasn't trying to be suspicious, but it's hard not to notice when someone you love seems to have entire conversations you're not a part of. One night, I decided to wait up for her. The clock ticked past midnight and the house was so quiet it felt like it might collapse under the weight of the silence. When I finally heard the key turn in the lock, I braced myself. "Ethan, you're still up?" she asked, surprised. "I wanted to talk to you," I said, keeping my voice calm. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? Annoyance? Can it wait until morning? I'm exhausted. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as she disappeared into the bedroom. But it couldn't wait. It shouldn't have to wait. The next day, I tried again. Over breakfast, I brought up the idea of spending a weekend together. Just the two of us, like we used to. I suggested a cabin in the mountains, a quiet getaway to reconnect. Her response? A distracted, maybe, as she scrolled through her phone. That single word hit harder than any argument ever could. A weekend for us wasn't a priority for her. It was a maybe, something to fit in between everything else. It was then I realized that I wasn't just lonely. I was invisible. The tension wasn't always loud. It wasn't yelling or slam doors. It was the subtle things. The way she'd rush through dinner to get ready for another night out. The way she'd laugh at something on her phone but wouldn't share it with me. The way she'd brush off my attempts to talk about our relationship. Even the things that used to bring us together started to feel strained. Movie nights turned into her scrolling through her phone while I watched alone. Our shared jokes felt forced, like she was humoring me instead of truly laughing. I found myself analyzing everything she said, every little action, searching for some clue about where I stood in her life. Was I overthinking? Maybe. But when someone starts to pull away, it's hard not to look for reasons why. One evening, I suggested we have dinner with her sister, Grace. Lily hesitated, then agreed, but only after a moment of what looked like reluctance. At dinner, Grace seemed to pick up on the distance between us. She asked how we were doing, and I waited for Lily to answer, curious about what she'd say. "We're fine," she said, smiling too brightly. Fine. Such a small word, but it felt like a lie. After dinner, Grace pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth, that I didn't know anymore. The tension was growing, stretching between us like a rubber band pulled too tight. I could feel it in every interaction, every word left unsaid. I wanted to believe it wouldn't snap, that we'd find a way to ease the strain. But deep down, I knew that wasn't up to me alone. Lily had to want it too. And lately, it felt like she didn't even see the band at all. You know, there's a strange comfort in finally saying out loud what's been weighing on your chest. That first time I confided in Daniel, I felt like a dam breaking. It wasn't easy. I mean, how do you admit to your best friend that your marriage feels like it's slowly slipping through your fingers? We were sitting in his small, cluttered garage. Daniel's the kind of guy who tinkers with everything, cars, lawnmowers, gadgets, always with grease-streaked hands and a problem-solving mindset. He was fixing an old radio when I just blurted it out. "She's pulling away," I said, staring down at my coffee cup like it held the answers. Daniel looked up, his face thoughtful, not surprised. "Lily?" "Yeah, I don't know what to do. She's always out with friends, always distracted. I feel invisible." He put the screwdriver down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "You've talked to her about it, right?" "Of course," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "But it's like she doesn't see the problem. She thinks I'm overreacting, being insecure. I don't want to be that guy, you know, the jealous husband." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's not jealousy if you're asking for the basics, man. Respect, attention, time. That's marriage, isn't it?" His words hit hard because they were true. But it wasn't just about time or respect. It was about the way she used to light up when she saw me. The way she used to make me feel like I mattered. Daniel didn't push for more. He just handed me a wrench and asked if I wanted to help with the radio. And for the next hour, I found some peace in the rhythm of fixing something, even if it wasn't what I really needed fixed. The next day, I stopped by Grace's house. Grace is Lily's older sister, and she's always been a steady, reliable presence in our lives. If Daniel was my sounding board, Grace was my bridge to understanding Lily. "You both seem off," she said as soon as I sat down. "What's going on, Ethan?" "It's Lily," I admitted, unsure how much to share. "She's been distant, and I don't know how to reach her anymore." Grace's expression softened as she listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to defend Lily. She just let me talk, and that alone felt like a small relief. "I've noticed," she said when I finished. "She's always been independent, but this feels different. Have you asked her why she's out so much?" "I've tried," I said, shaking my head. "She says it's just friends, just fun. But it feels like there's something more, like she's avoiding me." Grace sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Lily's always had this fear of being tied down. Not by you, by life. She's scared of losing herself. Maybe she doesn't realize that in trying to hold on to her independence, she's losing something even more important." Her words stayed with me long after I left her house. They made me think about the woman I fell in love with, the one who was fearless and vibrant, but also open and grounded. Somewhere along the way, she'd built walls, and I was left standing on the outside. I kept replaying Grace's insight in my mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a way to break through to Lily. But every time I thought about bringing it up, I hesitated. What if it pushed her further away? What if it made her see me as the anchor dragging her down? Daniel called that evening, his voice upbeat. "Hey, I've been thinking. You should come out with me this weekend. Just us guys. Blow off some steam." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't feel much like going out. "You need this, Ethan," he insisted. "Sitting at home, waiting for her to change, it's not helping. You can't fix this if you're running on empty." He was right, of course, but as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want to run on anything but hope. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. But as much as Daniel and Grace tried to help, I knew the answers wouldn't come from them. They had to come from Lily. The question was, how long could I keep waiting for her to give them to me? It wasn't like I didn't try. God knows I tried. When you're watching the person you love drift further and further away, you cling to the idea that you can fix it. That if you just do the right thing, say the right words, everything will snap back into place like it used to be. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. One Friday evening, I planned a surprise. Lily loved Italian food, so I made reservations at her favorite little restaurant downtown, the one with the candlelit tables and soft music playing in the background. I even asked them to save our favorite table, the one near the window with the view of the city lights. She came home late that night, as usual, heels clicking against the floor as she hummed some tune I didn't recognize. When I told her about the dinner plans, her smile was faint, polite. "That's sweet, Ethan," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "But I already promised Sarah I'd meet her for drinks." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, staring at her as she disappeared into the bedroom to change. The reservation came and went. I sat on the couch that night, eating leftover pizza, staring at the empty space next to me where she used to sit. The next weekend, I tried something different. Lily always said we needed more adventure, so I suggested a day trip to the lake. We could rent a kayak, pack a picnic, maybe even watch the sunset together. She hesitated, chewing her lip. "That sounds nice," she said, but there was a flicker of reluctance in her eyes. "Maybe next weekend? I've got a thing with the girls tomorrow." The girls. It was always the girls. I didn't press the issue. I just nodded, forcing a smile as she walked away. But inside, I was starting to wonder if there was any room left for me in her life. One night, desperate to break through the wall between us, I decided to talk to her. Really talk. She was sitting at the dining table scrolling through her phone when I slid into the chair across from her. Lily, I said, my voice steady but soft. Can we just take a weekend for ourselves? No distractions, just us. She barely looked up. We live together, Ethan. Isn't that enough time? No, I replied, my throat tightening. It's not. I feel like we're roommates, not partners. I miss you. I miss us. That got her attention. She set her phone down, her expression a mix of surprise and irritation. Ethan, we've been over this. I'm not neglecting you. I just need time for myself. Everyone does. But it's not just time for yourself, I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. It's all the time. I feel like I'm the last thing on your list. She stood up, shaking her head. I can't do this right now. And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the bedroom, leaving me alone with the silence. I kept trying, though. I booked tickets to a concert I knew she'd love. She canceled the day before, saying she had a work meeting that ran late. I suggested we cook dinner together one evening, a simple, fun thing we used to do all the time. She agreed, but spent most of the time on her phone, only half engaged. Every attempt to reconnect felt like grasping at straws. I was putting in all this effort, and she barely seemed to notice. Or care. I started to wonder if she even wanted to be saved. If maybe, deep down, she'd already decided she was done but didn't know how to say it. The hardest part wasn't the rejection. It was the hope. That tiny, stubborn voice in the back of my head saying, "This time will be different. This time, she'll see how much you care. This time, she'll remember why she fell in love with you." But no matter what I did, that hope kept shrinking bit by bit with every unreturned glance, every distracted answer, every empty promise of next time. And still, I kept trying. Because that's what you do when you love someone, isn't it? You keep trying, even when it feels like you're the only one fighting for something that used to matter so much. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but there's a moment in every crumbling relationship where you realize you've reached the edge. That night, as I sat on the couch staring at my reflection in the darkened TV screen, I felt it. The overwhelming weight of things left unsaid. Lily was in the bedroom, humming to herself as she got ready for yet another night out. The sound of her laughter floated down the hallway, light and carefree, while I sat there feeling like a ghost in my own home. I told myself that this was it. No more pretending, no more swallowing my words. Tonight, we were going to have the conversation we'd been avoiding for far too long. When she emerged, dressed in a sleek black dress and heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, I felt my chest tighten. She was stunning, as always, but it only made the distance between us feel more glaring. "Lily," I said, standing as she reached for her purse. She paused, glancing at me. "What is it? I'm running late." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "We need to talk." Her hand froze on the strap of her purse, and for a moment, her expression softened. But then the usual impatience crept back in. "Can it wait?" "Ethan, I'm meeting the girls in 15 minutes. "No," I said firmly, surprising even myself with the sharpness of my tone. "It can't wait anymore." She sighed, setting her purse down with a deliberate slowness that made it clear she wasn't happy. "Fine. What's so important?" I gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on me like she was bracing for an argument. "I feel like I'm losing you," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. "Every night you're out, every conversation feels hollow. I'm here, Lily, but it feels like you're somewhere else." Her eyebrows knit together, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face. "We've been over this, Ethan. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to enjoy my life." "I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong," I countered, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's not just about what you're doing. It's about what you're not doing. You're not here. You're not with me." Her arms tightened across her chest. I don't see why this is such a big deal. Everyone has friends. Everyone goes out. Yes, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. But not at the expense of their marriage. Lily, it feels like I'm the last thing on your list and I can't keep living like this. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze narrowing. So, what are you saying, Ethan? That I should just stop having a life because you're insecure? Insecure? I repeated, the word stinging more than I wanted to admit. This isn't about insecurity, Lily. It's about respect. It's about balance. It's about feeling like I matter to you. For a moment, her expression wavered, and I thought I saw something close to guilt in her eyes. But then she shook her head, her voice hardening. This is ridiculous. You're blowing things out of proportion. I need space, Ethan. I can't be everything for you. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, and I took a step back, the weight of her dismissal settling over me. I'm not asking you to be everything, I said quietly. I'm just asking you to meet me halfway. She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw tight, before picking up her purse again. I can't do this right now, she said, her tone clipped. We'll talk later. Will we? I asked, but she was already walking to the door. The sound of the door closing behind her was louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet house. I sank back onto the couch, my head in my hands, the reality of the situation pressing down on me. This wasn't just about a missed dinner or a canceled plan. This was about the foundation of our marriage, something I'd always thought was unshakable. Now it felt like I was the only one standing on it, watching her drift further and further away. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I could keep holding it up on my own. I didn't expect silence to be so loud. After she left that night, the quiet in the house felt oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of her presence. It was the absence of everything we used to be. I had always believed that love could weather anything, that as long as two people cared enough, they could find a way to make things work. But caring wasn't enough anymore, not when it felt like I was carrying the weight of our marriage on my own. The days following our argument felt like a fog. We barely spoke. When she was home, she was distant, her responses clipped, her focus elsewhere. I'd find myself watching her from across the room, searching her face for some sign that she was feeling what I was feeling. But if she did, she didn't show it. It wasn't until I overheard her talking to Grace on the phone that I realized she might be grappling with something deeper. I don't know, Grace, she said, her voice muffled but heavy with emotion. Ethan he doesn't understand. I need space, and he's smothering me. I don't know how to make him see that without hurting him. I felt like an intruder, standing there in the hallway, listening to words that weren't meant for me. But more than that, I felt confused. Smothering her? I thought I'd been doing everything I could to give her space, to let her have her freedom without losing her completely. That night, I tried to approach her again. Lily, I said softly, sitting beside her on the couch. She didn't look up from her phone, but I pressed on. I overheard you talking to Grace. That got her attention. She set the phone down, her eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan, you were eavesdropping? No, I said quickly. I heard a little of what you said, about feeling smothered. Is that how you really feel? Her shoulders tensed, and she let out a long sigh. I don't know, Ethan. Maybe? It's not that you're doing anything wrong, but I just feel trapped sometimes. Like I'm losing myself. Losing yourself? I repeated, trying to understand. Lily, I've never tried to stop you from being who you are. I love who you are. I just don't understand why being with me feels like a trap. She looked away, her jaw tightening. It's not you, Ethan. It's me. Sometimes I feel like being married means I have to give up parts of myself, and I don't know if I'm ready for that. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. I didn't know how to respond. Was this an identity crisis? A phase? Or was she telling me she wasn't sure she wanted to be married anymore? Lily, I said carefully, I don't want you to feel like you have to give up anything. But marriage is about compromise. It's about building something together. I need to know that you still want to build that with me. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I don't know, Ethan. I need time to figure that out. Time. That word again. It felt like a dagger every time she said it because time wasn't something I could control. I could give her all the time in the world. But what if she came back and realized I wasn't what she wanted? The days that followed were a strange limbo. Lily started staying home more, but the space between us didn't shrink. If anything, it grew wider. She was there physically, but emotionally, she was somewhere else. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photo album she'd pulled from the closet. It was the one from our honeymoon, filled with pictures of us laughing and exploring the coastline, so full of hope and love. I sat down across from her, unsure what to say. I miss this, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Me too, I said, my chest tightening. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know when we stopped being those people, Ethan. I don't know how to get back to that. Maybe we don't, I said gently. Maybe we find a way to be who we are now, together. She nodded slowly, but her expression remained clouded with doubt. I don't know if I can. It was in that moment I realized that Lily wasn't just struggling with us. She was struggling with herself. And as much as I wanted to fix her, I couldn't. That was something she had to do on her own. And that might be the hardest part of all. After weeks of feeling like a bystander in my own marriage, I realized something had to change. Not necessarily between Lily and me, though I desperately hoped it would, but within myself. I couldn't keep waiting for her to come around while I stood still, letting the silence of our house consume me. The first step was the hardest. One Saturday morning, I grabbed my keys and decided to go somewhere. Anywhere. Driving aimlessly through the city, I ended up at a park I hadn't visited in years. I sat on a bench near the lake, watching kids feed ducks and couples stroll hand in hand. It should have made me feel lonelier, but oddly enough, it didn't. For the first time in weeks, I felt still. That same week, Daniel called. Hey man, I've got an idea. There's a volunteer event at the community center this weekend. They need people to help with the food bank. You should come. I hesitated. Volunteering wasn't something I'd ever thought about, but then I realized I didn't have any reason to say no. Sure, I said, surprising both of us. That Saturday, I found myself surrounded by boxes of canned goods and an eclectic mix of people who, like me, were there to do something meaningful. It wasn't glamorous, stacking shelves and organizing food donations, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. One of the volunteers, a woman named Sophie, noticed my awkwardness and struck up a conversation. First time? She asked, her warm smile putting me at ease. Yeah, I admitted. My friend dragged me into it. Well, welcome to the chaos, she said, laughing. It's actually kind of fun once you get into the rhythm. She was right. By the end of the day, I felt lighter, more grounded. Sophie and I didn't exchange numbers or make plans to meet again, but her kindness stuck with me. It reminded me that there were still good people out there, and maybe I could start being one of them again. Over the next few weeks, I found myself seeking out more of these small escapes. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. Wandering through the city with a camera, looking for moments to capture, became a kind of therapy. I even started going to the gym again. The first time I walked in, the sight of all the people running on treadmills and lifting weights was intimidating, but I stuck with it. By the third week, I noticed I wasn't just stronger physically. I was mentally clearer too. It wasn't just about finding hobbies or filling my time. It was about rediscovering parts of myself that I'd let fade away. For so long, My identity had been tied to being Lily's husband. When that connection started to fray, I realized how little I'd invested in who I was outside of our marriage. One evening, after a particularly satisfying photography session, I came home to an empty house. Normally, the quiet would have felt oppressive, but this time, it didn't bother me as much. I made myself dinner, sat down with a book, and felt a small but growing sense of peace. I wasn't over Lily, far from it. But I was starting to understand that waiting for her to fill the void in my life wasn't fair, to her or to me. I needed to become whole on my own, no matter how hard it was. Daniel noticed the change. "You're looking better, man," he said one night over beers. "Like you're finally taking care of yourself." "Thanks," I said, meaning it. I still thought about Lily constantly, about the life we'd built and the life we were losing. But I was learning that love isn't about holding on so tightly that you lose yourself. It's about finding a balance, a way to be whole together without sacrificing the core of who you are. Whether or not Lily and I found our way back to that balance, I didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. Because I was finally learning how to stand on my own 2 feet again. And that, I realized, was the first step toward anything worth rebuilding. I'll admit, talking to Grace wasn't my idea at first. She called me one evening, her voice laced with that subtle mix of concern and curiosity she was so good at. Grace had always been Lily's protector, the older sister who could cut through the nonsense with a single look. "Ethan," she began after we exchanged pleasantries, "what's going on with you two? Lily seems off." For a moment, I considered brushing her off. It felt strange, airing out my problems to someone so close to Lily. But then I realized I needed someone who knew her better than anyone else. Someone who might help me make sense of everything. "Grace, I don't know where to start," I said, sighing into the phone. "It's like she's slipping away, and no matter what I do, I can't reach her." There was a pause on the other end, and then she said softly, "I've noticed. She's been distant, even with me. What's she telling you?" I explained everything. How Lily seemed more invested in her nights out than in our marriage. How every attempt to connect with her was met with resistance or dismissal. Grace listened intently, never interrupting, her silence encouraging me to keep talking. When I finished, she let out a heavy sigh. "Ethan, this isn't easy to hear, but I think Lily's scared." "Scared?" I repeated, confused. "Yes," Grace said firmly. "She's always been fiercely independent. Even as kids, she hated the idea of being tied down or losing her sense of self. Marriage was a big leap for her. I think she loves you, but she's terrified that love means losing who she is." Her words hit me like a freight train. It wasn't that I hadn't considered Lily's perspective, but hearing it put into words made it feel more real. "What am I supposed to do, Grace?" I asked, my voice tinged with desperation. "I've tried everything. I've given her space. I've planned things for us. I've talked to her. Nothing seems to work." Grace hesitated, then said, "Ethan, maybe it's not about doing something. Maybe it's about understanding her fear and giving her room to confront it. Sometimes people need to figure things out on their own, without feeling pressured." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but deep down, I knew she was right. A few days later, Grace invited both of us to dinner at her house. It felt like a neutral ground, a place where the tension between us might soften, even if just for an evening. Lily was hesitant at first, but she agreed, and for a brief moment, I felt hopeful. The dinner started off light. Grace, ever the mediator, kept the conversation flowing with stories from her childhood and jokes about her kids. Lily seemed more relaxed, laughing at Grace's anecdotes and even glancing at me with a faint smile now and then. But as the evening wore on, the undercurrent of our strained relationship crept in. Grace brought up a memory of Lily and me from when we were first dating. How inseparable we'd been. How we'd always been the last to leave family gatherings because we couldn't stop talking to each other. Lily's smile faltered. Things change, she said quietly, her eyes flickering toward me. They do, Grace agreed, her tone gentle. But love doesn't have to. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over us like a heavy blanket. Lily excused herself to the kitchen, and I followed after a moment, finding her staring out the window, lost in thought. "You okay?" I asked softly. She nodded, though her expression said otherwise. "It's just hard hearing all of this. I know I've been distant, Ethan. I just don't know how to fix it." Her honesty caught me off guard. "You don't have to fix it alone," I said. "But I need to know that you want to try." She turned to face me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I do, Ethan. I'm just scared I'll mess it up even more." In that moment, I realized Grace was right. Lily's fear wasn't about me or our marriage. It was about herself, about not knowing how to reconcile who she was with who she wanted to be. Grace's dinner wasn't a magic solution, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, Lily and I left with something resembling hope, even if it was fragile. And for that, I was grateful. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first realized the extent to which Lily's world had drifted away from mine. She was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with her phone in hand, laughing at something on the screen. I stood in the doorway, watching her, feeling like an outsider in my own home. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced up, barely registering my presence. "Oh, just a meme in the group chat," she said, the smile lingering on her lips as she returned to her phone. The group chat. It was always the group chat. At first, I hadn't thought much about it. Everyone needs friends, right? People to vent to, laugh with, and share moments that don't always fit into a marriage. But over time, it felt like this group chat, and by extension, her friends, had become the center of her universe. One evening, when she was out again, I decided to try and understand. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, looking for clues about when things had started to change. There were pictures of us, smiling at family gatherings, hiking together, laughing over dinner. And then, gradually, the photos shifted. More of her with her friends, fewer of us. I didn't resent her friends, not exactly, but I started to wonder what they thought of me. Did they know how much I was struggling to keep our marriage together? Did they encourage her to spend so much time away? Or were they just oblivious, enjoying the carefree version of Lily they got to see? The next time she mentioned a night out, I decided to ask. "Lily," I said, trying to keep my tone even, "do your friends ever ask about me?" She paused, her hand hovering over her phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do they know about what's going on between us? About how distant things have been?" Her brow furrowed, and she set her phone down. "Why would I tell them that? It's personal, Ethan." "Because they seem to know everything else," I said, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. Her eyes flashed with irritation. "They're my friends. I don't have to share every detail of my life with them, or with you, for that matter." The conversation ended there, but it stayed with me. The idea that her friends were such a significant part of her life, yet they didn't seem to know, or care, about the state of our marriage. A few weeks later, I had an unexpected encounter with one of her friends, Carla, at the grocery store. She greeted me warmly, her usual bubbly self, and started chatting about Lily. "She's been so much fun lately," Carla said, laughing. "Always the life of the party. You're lucky to have such a cool wife." Lucky. That word stung more than it should have. "Yeah, she's great," I said, forcing a smile. As we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that Carla's version of Lily wasn't the same one I was living with. To them, she was the fun, carefree woman who lit up every room she entered. To me, she was someone I barely recognized, caught between the life she was building with them and the life we had built together. One night, as she was getting ready to go out, I asked her a question that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Lily, what do you get from them that you don't get from me? She froze, her hand halfway to her earring. What kind of question is that? A real one, I said, my voice soft but firm. I'm not trying to pick a fight. I need to understand. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Ethan, it's not about you. It's just easy with them. No expectations, no pressure. I can be myself without worrying about whether I'm doing something wrong. Her words hurt, but they also gave me clarity. It wasn't just about her friends. It was about what they represented, a world where she didn't have to face the challenges of our marriage, where she could escape the weight of our struggles. I want you to have that, I said after a moment. But I also want to be part of your world, Lily, not just the guy you come home to after the fun is over. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands as if trying to find the right words. I don't know how to balance it, she admitted finally. Neither did I. But at least now I understood a little more about the divide between us. And understanding, I hoped, was the first step toward bridging it. It started at the food bank. I didn't know it at the time, but meeting Sophie would shift something in me. Not in a romantic way, but in a way that reminded me of the parts of myself I had forgotten. She was one of those effortlessly warm people, the kind who could put anyone at ease. The first time we spoke, she caught me fumbling with a heavy box of canned goods and grinned. Need a hand, rookie? Only if you don't mind me looking incompetent, I joked, setting the box down with a huff. Sophie laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that made me realize how much I missed simple, unforced connections. Everyone starts somewhere, she said, handing me a water bottle. I was just as clumsy my first day here. Let me show you how to stack those without breaking your back. We fell into an easy rhythm as we worked side by side, chatting about everything from favorite books to embarrassing high school stories. It wasn't long before I found myself looking forward to the volunteer shifts, not just for the work, but for the rare moments of camaraderie. One day, during a lull in the chaos, she asked, "So, Ethan, what brings you here?" Most people show up because they're either bored or looking for a sense of purpose. Which one is it for you? I hesitated, debating how much to reveal. A little of both, I guess, I said finally. Things have been complicated at home. Volunteering seemed like a good way to clear my head. She nodded, her expression softening. I get it. Sometimes you just need to step away from the noise to figure out what really matters. It was such a simple statement, but it struck a chord. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to say that. Someone who didn't know the history, the baggage, the layers of guilt and frustration. Over the weeks, our conversations deepened. Sophie had her own stories of heartbreak, of trying to navigate relationships that didn't work out. She never pried into my situation, but her empathy was unmistakable. One afternoon, as we were wrapping up a shift, she turned to me and said, "You know, you don't have to carry everything alone. Sometimes just saying things out loud makes them easier to handle." It felt like permission to unburden myself, even if only a little. My wife and I are struggling, I admitted. She's distant, and I don't know how to reach her. It's like we're living two completely separate lives under the same roof. Sophie nodded, her gaze steady. That's tough. But it sounds like you're trying. That counts for something, even if it doesn't feel like it. Her words didn't magically solve my problems, but they gave me a sense of validation I hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded me that my efforts mattered, even if the results weren't immediate or obvious. As our shifts together became more frequent, Sophie and I built a friendship that felt safe and uncomplicated. She wasn't there to fix me, and I wasn't looking for her to. But her presence was a lifeline in a time when I often felt like I was drowning. One day, she handed me a small notebook. "It's a journal," she explained. "Sometimes when things feel too messy to say out loud, writing them down helps. You don't have to share it with anyone. Just let it be yours." I took it home and stared at it for days before finally opening it. At first, the words came out jumbled and raw, fragments of frustration, sadness, and longing. But over time, it became a place where I could sort through my emotions, a quiet space to process the chaos. Through my conversations with Sophie and the clarity I found in writing, I began to see my situation differently. I wasn't the only one in pain. Lily was struggling too, even if she couldn't or wouldn't express it. Sophie never gave me advice or told me what to do, but her presence reminded me of the importance of kindness, patience, and self-reflection. She became a quiet catalyst for my growth, helping me realize that I couldn't pour from an empty cup. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was beginning to refill it. The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home. It was unassuming, plain, white, and unmarked, except for my name scrawled neatly in the center. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a bill or some bank statement. But when I tore it open and saw the letterhead, my stomach dropped. Lily's name was there, along with a date, a case number, and those words that cut deeper than I thought they could. Notice of divorce proceedings. For a moment, I just stood there, the paper trembling in my hands. This wasn't how I thought things would end. Even with the distance between us, the arguments, the nights spent apart emotionally, if not physically, I always believed there was still something worth saving. But this was a line I didn't think she'd cross. I sat down at the dining table, staring at the letter as if looking at it long enough would make it disappear. My mind raced with questions, accusations, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could she file for divorce without even telling me? Without talking to me? Was this really what she wanted, or was this some kind of message? I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over her name in my contact list. I wanted answers. I wanted to hear her voice and ask why she didn't think our marriage was worth fighting for. But the anger bubbling under the surface kept me from pressing call. Instead, I poured myself a drink. One drink turned into two, and by the time I made it to three, I realized I wasn't angry. I was devastated. This wasn't just a legal document. It was the end of everything we'd built together. Everything I'd believed we could still rebuild. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the letter sitting on the nightstand like some kind of cruel reminder. Memories of Lily flooded my mind. The way she used to laugh so freely, the way she'd wrap her arms around me after a long day, the way she looked at me when we exchanged vows, promising forever. The next morning, I went for a long walk. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to think, to process what this meant. As I walked, I started replaying every moment that had led us to this point. Every argument, every missed connection, every time I'd felt like I was shouting into a void. When I finally returned home, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of her voice or her presence. It was the absence of hope. For the first time, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to save us, I couldn't do it alone. But there was still a part of me that refused to believe this was the end. Divorce wasn't just paperwork. It was a choice. A choice that required two signatures. Over the weeks, our conversations deepened. Sophie had her own stories of heartbreak, of trying to navigate relationships that didn't work out. She never pried into my situation, but her empathy was unmistakable. One afternoon, as we were wrapping up a shift, she turned to me and said, "You know, you don't have to carry everything alone. Sometimes just saying things out loud makes them easier to handle." It felt like permission to unburden myself, even if only a little. My wife and I are struggling, I admitted. She's distant, and I don't know how to reach her. It's like we're living two completely separate lives under the same roof. Sophie nodded, her gaze steady. "That's tough. But it sounds like you're trying. That counts for something, even if it doesn't feel like it." Her words didn't magically solve my problems, but they gave me a sense of validation I hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded me that my efforts mattered, even if the results weren't immediate or obvious. As our shifts together became more frequent, Sophie and I built a friendship that felt safe and uncomplicated. She wasn't there to fix me, and I wasn't looking for her to. But her presence was a lifeline in a time when I often felt like I was drowning. One day, she handed me a small notebook. "It's a journal," she explained. "Sometimes when things feel too messy to say out loud, writing them down helps. You don't have to share it with anyone. Just let it be yours." I took it home and stared at it for days before finally opening it. At first, the words came out jumbled and raw, fragments of frustration, sadness, and longing. But over time, it became a place where I could sort through my emotions, a quiet space to process the chaos. Through my conversations with Sophie and the clarity I found in writing, I began to see my situation differently. I wasn't the only one in pain. Lily was struggling too, even if she couldn't or wouldn't express it. Sophie never gave me advice or told me what to do, but her presence reminded me of the importance of kindness, patience, and self-reflection. She became a quiet catalyst for my growth, helping me realize that I couldn't pour from an empty cup. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was beginning to refill it. The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home. It was unassuming, plain, white, and unmarked, except for my name scrawled neatly in the center. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a bill or some bank statement. But when I tore it open and saw the letterhead, my stomach dropped. Lily's name was there, along with a date, a case number, and those words that cut deeper than I thought they could. Notice of divorce proceedings. For a moment, I just stood there, the paper trembling in my hands. This wasn't how I thought things would end. Even with the distance between us, the arguments, the nights spent apart emotionally, if not physically, I always believed there was still something worth saving. But this was a line I didn't think she'd cross. I sat down at the dining table, staring at the letter as if looking at it long enough would make it disappear. My mind raced with questions, accusations, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could she file for divorce without even telling me? Without talking to me? Was this really what she wanted, or was this some kind of message? I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over her name in my contact list. I wanted answers. I wanted to hear her voice and ask why she didn't think our marriage was worth fighting for. But the anger bubbling under the surface kept me from pressing call. Instead, I poured myself a drink. One drink turned into two, and by the time I made it to 3, I realized I wasn't angry. I was devastated. This wasn't just a legal document. It was the end of everything we'd built together. Everything I'd believed we could still rebuild. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the letter sitting on the nightstand like some kind of cruel reminder. Memories of Lily flooded my mind. The way she used to laugh so freely, the way she'd wrap her arms around me after a long day, the way she looked at me when we exchanged vows, promising forever. The next morning, I went for a long walk. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to think, to process what this meant. As I walked, I started replaying every moment that had led us to this point. Every argument, every missed connection, every time I'd felt like I was shouting into a void. When I finally returned home, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of her voice or her presence. It was the absence of hope. For the first time, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to save us, I couldn't do it alone. But there was still a part of me that refused to believe this was the end. Divorce wasn't just paperwork. It was a choice. A choice that required 2 signatures. For you. For us. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was something. An acknowledgement of the pain we'd both carried and a willingness to confront it together. Or at least, to try. As we left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the street. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the darkness between us might not be permanent. We still had a long way to go, but at least now, we were standing on the same road. And that, I realized, was a start. It's strange how life moves on, even when you feel like you're stuck in place. After the meeting with Lily, I felt a mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and a faint, flickering hope. She said she wanted to try, but there was no clear roadmap for what that would look like. So we drifted into a sort of limbo. Not together, not apart, just two people trying to figure out how to rebuild something that had already cracked. I threw myself into the things that gave me a sense of purpose. Volunteering at the food bank became a weekly ritual, a place where I could lose myself in the work and find clarity in the simplicity of helping others. My photography hobby, once an occasional distraction, became a full-fledged passion. I spent hours wandering the city, capturing moments that felt raw and real. Sunlight filtering through trees, kids playing in the park, couples holding hands. Each snapshot felt like a tiny piece of beauty I could hold on to, a reminder that even in chaos, there was still something worth cherishing. Lily, on the other hand, started focusing on herself in ways I hadn't seen before. She joined a yoga class, something she'd always talked about but never made time for. She even started journaling, something she once teased me for when I mentioned Sophie's suggestion. It was as if she was trying to untangle the knots within herself, piece by piece. We spoke occasionally, careful to tread lightly around each other. Our conversations weren't like they used to be, but they were honest, even if they were painful. She admitted how scared she'd been, how she'd let her fear of losing her independence overshadow the love she had for me. I told her how much I'd missed her, how lonely it had felt to watch her pull away. Each word felt like a step forward, even if we weren't sure where the road was leading. Months passed. The divorce papers sat unsigned on my desk, a silent reminder of the crossroads we were still standing at. I'd left them there intentionally, unsure if I was ready to close that chapter completely. Lily never asked about them, and I didn't bring them up. It felt like we were both waiting to see if there was anything left to save. One evening, while out with Daniel at a small gallery downtown, I spotted her. She was standing in front of a photograph, her head tilted slightly as she studied the image. It was one of mine, a black and white shot of the lake, taken during one of my many solo walks. The sight of her there, so absorbed in something I'd created, caught me off guard. "Ethan," she said when she turned and saw me. Her voice was soft, and her smile was hesitant but genuine. "Lily," I replied, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. For a moment, we just stood there, the noise of the gallery fading into the background. Then she gestured to the photograph. "This is beautiful. It feels peaceful." "Thanks," I said, my throat tightening. "It's one of my favorites." We ended up talking for nearly an hour, standing in the corner of the gallery as people milled around us. It wasn't the kind of conversation we'd had during our marriage, full of logistics and frustrations. This was different. It was light, almost tentative, as if we were rediscovering each other as strangers who shared a history. Before we parted, she said something that stuck with me. "I'm proud of you, Ethan, for everything you've done, for how far you've come. I can see it in your work, in how you carry yourself. You're different, stronger." "Thanks," I said, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "You seem different too, happier." She nodded, her eyes shining with something I couldn't quite place. "I think I am." We didn't make any promises that night. We didn't talk about the divorce papers or whether we'd try again. But as I walked home, I realized I felt lighter. Maybe it was closure, or maybe it was the possibility of a new beginning, either with her or without her. Either way, it felt like something had shifted. Lily and I were no longer the same people we'd been when we started this journey. And maybe that was okay. Because sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of who you were to make space for who you're becoming. Whether we found our way back to each other or not, I knew one thing for certain. We were both finally moving forward. And that was enough.